Thank you very much. I'll try to be as succinct as possible in this deadliest of hours, which is the after lunch hours. I hope I'll be lively enough. You know, I'm a practitioner, not an expert, but I'm a big fan of crime fiction. And in crime fiction, when you deal with the crime has three parts. It has motive, means, and opportunity. You know, and we look at the Islamic State, the reality that exists with this organization, you know, we have to ask ourselves, what is motive, what is means, and what is opportunity? Obviously, motive is the why of somebody does thing. This is obviously the Takfiri Salafi jihadist worldview, which motivates ISIS and gives its actions meaning. This is something which has existed for a long time. It's not something new, but something which they've used in new and powerful ways. Means, obviously, are tangible things, the how of why something is done, like access to weapons or money, and is closely tied to the third description of the crime, opportunity, the where the thing occurs. And obviously, opportunity in the Middle East and in the rise of ISIS has been very closely connected with the collapse of authority, the dysfunction in Iraq under the Maliki government, the slaughter and anarchy in Assad's Syria. This is the opportunity that gave it to flourish. This is obviously when you talk about propaganda, when you talk about motivation, it is the events on the ground, is the political military reality in the region, which has given flesh to the ISIS dream. When we look at the struggle with ISIS, I think we need to work, obviously, on all of these fronts, on motive, means, and opportunity. But much of what governments have done, much of what actors in the region have done, has been focused on the technical parts, has been focused on the easy, none of this is easy, but on the easier parts, the things related to good governance, the things related to drying up the opportunity for extremists, the working on the means. Government has all too often avoided the most quicksilver, most difficult part, which is the part of the terrorist package which goes on in the mind. It is in my view that this is obviously the most difficult part of the counterterrorism struggle, and one that governments are most precisely eager to avoid because it involves ideas, it involves politics, it involves, let's say it, religion. It's in a way easier to kill a man than to kill an idea. So how can we address this? Or are we doomed to suffer the ISIS version of the death of 1,000 cuts, that infamous Chinese torture of being killed, being hurt a little bit at a time? You know, if we look at the ISIS package, it has certain elements, and some of them have been addressed. They've been addressed several times before, but it's good to look at them a bit deeper. Obviously, one that we've referred to is that the ISIS package is motivated by a Salafi worldview, a Salafi jihadist subculture. This is something that we see in the West with its own language, which I've dubbed jihad speak, and logic. There's a pool of people who are active and aggressive as apologists of this worldview, who are not actually terrorist members themselves, but are only slightly removed from it. This is, in a way, the permeable membrane of radicalization that we see in social media. Furthermore, in challenging the Salafi jihadist mindset, we need to look at redeeming the language. There are these terms, if you look at ISIS propaganda, if you look at the propaganda of ISIS supporters online, kufr, shirk, al-wala wal-bara, taghut, murtad, nifaq, jihad fi sabilillah. These are terms of power. They are toxic labels or trigger words that are used in a hermetic subworld, skeptical of outsiders. This is something that governments don't want to do. This is something governments maybe are ill-equipped to do. But language needs to be redeemed. The second part of the ISIS package is what psychologist Willard Galen has called in his work, Hatred, the Psychological Descendant of Violence, grievance collecting. This is part of the ISIS story. Galen, of course, referred to troubled individuals who will commit violence, serial crimes, based on a feeling of grievance, the touting up, you did this to me, you did that to me, and eventually they blow up. But of course, in the political language of Islam, is very much about grievance, along the lines of what Clifford Geertz has called in colonial instances as Islam as the language of refusal. In the West, obviously, we have many languages of refusal, not all of them toxic or violence, from anarchism to pacifism. Obviously, the third element of ISIS is one that is well known, and it's this utopianism. We are building a state. The very word of ISIS, right? The Islamic State is all about building, all about the future, all about progress. All too often we get tied up in the violent, repellent, horrific elements of ISIS propaganda, but that's only part of the package they're selling. Like utopians historically, like the French Revolution, like the Marxists, ISIS seeks to sell an image of the future which is attractive to its followers. Indeed, it's one of the tribunes of the French Revolution that said, "A nation regenerates itself only on heaps of corpses." Something very much similar to what ISIS would say. That was said, in 1798 in France. So this utopianism of ISIS is a strong element of appeal. So how do we combat the witch's brew that makes up this ideological appeal? As I said, the ISIS package is driven by the reality on the ground. The physical violence, the chaos, the crisis of authority again occurring to the Middle East is the most important element in what we see. But that is not enough. There needs to be focus on the worldview that motivates this beyond opportunity. So aside from realizing that Salafi jihadism serves as an antechamber, serves as the first steps towards the ISIS worldview, towards the Al-Qaeda worldview, what are some tactical, practical steps that need to be taken? Let's take things down to a very practical level. First of all, as has been discussed in social media, the single most powerful element that the Islamic State has in social media is numbers. Volume has value. Volume gives power. You all think about it, if you've all been on social media or anything else, if you have a large number of people saying the same thing, even if it's a stupid thing, there is power in number. If you look at the work of the West, Western governments, the work that I did in the US government, it's this bizarre reality that if you take what the US government does, what Western governments does, what Arab governments do, what people in civil society do, you put it all together, you're still outnumbered by what ISIS does. So numbers matter, and there's that crying need to create greater volume in a response to them. Secondly, content. ISIS is prolific in its production. It is a content provider. It's a terrorist group that also creates content. It's a news agency. It's a terrorist group that also does the news, as was previously said. It has a symbiotic, parasitic relationship with the news cycle and has mastered the manipulation of the news cycle. And you see that, and that provides an understanding, for example, of how it uses the media. It needs to have something happen, like a movie star, like Kim Kardashian or whatever. It needs to have stuff happen. The best thing for ISIS, of course, is military victory. Cities falling, advances, weapons, prisoners. But if you don't have that, you blow up a church, you blow up a historical site, you find interesting and perverse ways of decapitating people or burning them alive. This is news creation. So you need to fight content with content. Not easy to do. There are some preliminary steps. If we look where we were, say, a year ago after the fall of Mosul, we've made progress. There are baby steps happening with governments and non-government organizations creating content. And you don't need one content. ISIS propaganda is not one thing. It's about building, it's about destroying, it's about religion, it's about adventure, it's about action, it's about revenge. The content, the anti-ISIS content, also needs to be multifaceted. There needs to be a religious element, there needs to be a sarcastic element, there needs to be a cool fact-based element. And we're beginning to see some of these things. You see things like, a recent person on Twitter that is using an anime approach, a manga approach to mock ISIS. Or there's the very new, it seems silly to us, the ISIS karaoke Twitter feed, which is, again, another quiver, another arrow in the quiver, another effort to do this. Maximizing the stories and visuals of recanters, of defectors, deepening understanding among at-risk populations about the responsibilities of citizenship, of loyalty. When you talk about al-wala wal-bara, this is a Salafi concept about loyalty and disloyalty. These are issues that need to be addressed. The third thing, which is really important and is something that governments have not done at all, is radicalization covers many sins. And of course, radicalization means different things to different people. It's a messy, complicated, individual process. And what is often lacking in the counterterrorism approach is an individualized way to respond to it. The handmade, the one-to-one interaction, the tailored, immediate approach, whether online or off, is something that is really needed in the battle against this ideological extremism. This is not something that we as governments or others have to invent out of whole cloth. There are individuals that are doing it, a little bit here, a little bit there. But again, we need greater numbers to do this, this work. There are individuals, for example, like Mubin Sheikh in Canada, or Humaira Khan in the United States, or some nascent work like the work of an NGO called Moonshot that is starting in the UK, that is beginning to look at this one-to-one dimension. People consume media, and people that can begin the radicalization process, but so much of what happens because I am talking to you, we have a relationship, and I'm able to take that relationship in a direction that I want to go. Very similar how people are going to be mobilized or committed to do certain other things, to do crimes, or to be groomed, say, by pedophiles or sexual predators in social media. The intimate, personal dimension is all too often ignored, especially by governments which are not good in the individual business. And yet, as Thomas Hegghammer said, the dimension, what we call the cultural, emotional dimension of radicalization is also important in the ISIS process. So there are those who talk of a generational struggle against ISIS are, in my view, somewhat mistaken. Certainly the worldview that we are fighting has been around for centuries and is extremely resilient. It won't be easy to eradicate overnight, but the astonishing rise of ISIS occurs mostly in the ungoverned spaces created on the ground by fateful political decisions, and in the virtual ungoverned spaces that we created online and allowed in political religious discourse. All too often, ISIS has found our doors unlocked and our voices silenced. It is our lack of care and attention that has given this toxic message the opportunity to flourish, and even a qualitative improvement in what we are already trying to do should yield very positive response in a relatively short period of time. ISIS is like the proverbial pufferfish. It puffs itself up to make itself look more powerful, more effective, more ubiquitous. As its motto says, Al-Dawla al-Islamiyya baqiya wa tatamaddad. The Islamic State is here to stay and growing. That is actually not the reality on the ground. The reality on the ground is dire enough. But we need to work both angles of the problem. We need to work against ISIS, the physical state, and ISIS, the state of mind. Indeed, it is my concern that we could very well see the elimination of ISIS, the physical state, but ISIS, the state of mind, ISIS, the idea of the caliphate, ISIS, the idea of renovating things like slavery, like renovating things like jizya and stuff like that, will be around for much longer than the physical state. So that's a kind of a short period of looking at where we are right now. Thank you very much.